Welcome to the Successful Athletes podcast presented by TrainerRoad, where we interview successful athletes to make you a faster cyclist. And in this case, we're joined all the way across the pond from me here in the United States. We're speaking with Lydia out of the UK. How you doing, Lydia?
Oh, good. Thank you. Great.
Where are you based out of?
I'm based in Winchester, which is in the south of England and about 15 miles from the sea. So, yeah, very nice.
Oh, nice.
But I'm in the country.
Close to
I just live in a very small little hamlet in the middle of the country, which is lovely.
Oh, how pretty. That's awesome. I'm picturing it right now. Very green and pretty.
It is. It's lovely. Lots of birds, wildlife, hills.
Yeah.
Little hills.
That's a perfect place to ride a bike.
It's perfect.
Sounds fantastic.
Absolutely wonderful for riding a bike. Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to get into today. So Lydia, probably the first thing to cover here and what immediately struck me. So when you wrote in to be on the Successful Athletes podcast, which thank you for doing that, by the way, and you can do so. You just go to trainerroad.com/podcast and click on a little banner there to go to the Successful Athletes podcast, and you can submit right there. I'll also have a link in the description below for you that will take you right there so that you can enter your story into this. And we want to hear from everybody that's used TrainerRoad to accomplish something. And you actually mentioned that TrainerRoad was helping you improve, and you thought that because of your age, you thought, oh, well, I'm probably not going to be able to make those sort of improvements or turn those weaknesses into strengths, that sort of a thing. So let's start right there. How old are you? And which usually is a question that a gentleman never asks a lady, but I figure it's critical for this one.
Yes.
So how old are you? And then also getting, let's talk about where you're at now in terms of age, but when you started becoming really athletic in general.
Well, I'm 64 and I'm getting on for being 65 in January. And I've had numerous problems and injuries, everything, you name it. I've had lots of things. And I was always very active as a kid and charging around, learnt to ride a bike at a very early age, running, climbing trees. And I wasn't brilliant at ball games and I always got bored with them very quickly, and I just used to not catch the ball, or, I just got bored and looked the other way, and, but I loved anything to do with running, or I loved swimming as well. So I was swimming, running. I was always on my bike in the garden and round the roads. So, yeah, very early age I started.
Yeah.
But obviously not
competitive.
Some point.
Right. At some point you became what you would classify yourself as a runner. Was that in your teen years or was that later on?
It was, funny enough. In my teen years, I used to go for long, long walks, and I loved nature, and I wasn't very sociable. I loved being out on my own with nature. And I just used to find that, I'd go for hours and I'd find that oftentimes I just wanted to go faster. So I just started to run and just thought running's lovely. I just enjoy being in the hills, running down the hill and wind in my hair and all that. And I think I was a natural runner because I never had a problem. I could run a mile and didn't train or anything. At that age, you don't really train. And then, so that's really that I knew I loved running just because it was so natural.
That's so interesting. That's like the most purest form of endurance sport right there.
Oh,
is just
it is, yeah.
The experience itself of running is what brought you into it. Did you get to a point where you were doing real training for running?
Oh, yes,
later on?
When school I was at, one of them, we did do a bit of running. The next school I was at, I wasn't particularly happy at all. And they weren't at all interested in running as a sport. And although I showed an interest, it was never taken up. But once I left school, I went to university, and there was a chap called Brendan Foster, who's a very famous runner. And he set up something which I think is similar to Park Run. They were called fun runs. And when I was at uni, I decided these things are about 2 miles. I decided I'd just join in, and I had a pair of plimsolls and a gym shoes, pair of shorts and a t-shirt. And I ran this thing, and I got round it, and it turned out I didn't win, but I was the second girl to come in.
Wow.
And I suddenly got interested then. So I then sort of 2 years later, I sort of started getting interested in training for running, and then entering things like cross country and joining a local club and entering cross country races. And I ran on the track as well. And then I sort of heard about road races and the longer distance things. So I really got into it big time, started training.
For how many years were you a competitive runner? And then on top of that as well, I guess, what distance did you gravitate toward the most or focus on?
I was probably competitive from aged about 20 till, well, right up really till I was about 48, 49.
Wow.
Long career of lots of and my distances were really, I mean, I seem to be pretty reasonably good at any distance from 1,500 meters to on the track to marathon and ultra marathon. And I ran the London to Brighton, which was in those days about 53 miles. So really everything from 1 mile to sort of, I think probably about 64, 70 miles was the longest run I did in one go. So everything and anything.
How cool. So kind of like a whole broad spectrum of it. And at some point you ended up getting interested in cycling. And this is a really interesting point that I want to cover here, because this is a really common story, actually, where a lot of people are interested in running and doing that, but then they end up in cycling. Usually it has to do with something with injury. Was that the case for you, avoiding a running injury, or did something else bring you to cycling?
Unfortunately, it's the same old story, so nothing brilliantly exciting. But I never really was. I like riding a bike just for having a bit of fun and falling off everywhere and just doing crazy things. But I just used to look at cyclists on the road as complete freaks. And I just thought, why would you ever want to do that? It's so boring. And then when I got injured, somebody said to me, oh, you need to go and do time trials. You can ride a bike. That'll help you recover from and it was an Achilles tendon injury at the time. So I got a bike. It was a Claude Butler, which is a touring type bike. And I sort of started by doing little time trials, usually the 10-mile ones, the shorter ones. And it was just so hard. I hated it. Every time I got to a hill, I just virtually had to stop. And I didn't have any idea about changing to a low gear. I just used to mash a huge gear. And being a runner, I couldn't spin at all. I just mashed a massive gear and about 70, 60 revs, and so no, it wasn't. I thought, I'm never going to be a cyclist. I don't enjoy it. It's not like running. But that changed.
And I guess, so once you got out of those time trials, because I'm going to fast forward for a bit here to now, and then we'll end up going back and getting into more detail here, but you now raced everything from cyclocross to you've even done 200-mile events. So, So what brought you from your competitive position in running to going, I want to, and I should say a stepping stone within that, to then doing time trials and being frustrated with the hills and the gears and everything else, to deciding that you wanted to race cyclocross, which is one of the more intimidating disciplines in many respects, just because it's so technical and there's so many elements to it. It's really dynamic.
Well, I think it started with the start of and the development of the first mountain bikes. And I was doing a few triathlons at the time, and I hated the cold. So the swim just wasn't my thing because I hate the cold. And then I met someone and they said, oh, you ought to get a mountain bike. So I bought a secondhand mountain bike, and I never looked back really, because I sort of rolled around my local terrain, which has lots of footpaths and tracks. I fell off everywhere, into nettles, got cuts, just kept falling off and everything. And because we didn't have suspension at all in those days. And eventually, I met a chap called Mick Ives who ran a mountain bike team, and he said, "Oh, you need to enter one of these races." So I entered the expert class, which I thought I'd probably be pretty good at, and I was pretty good until we got to going downhill, which I'd never really done off road, not proper downhill with roots and rocks and all sorts of weird things. And every time I went downhill, I'd sort of got towards the front of the group and I'd crash, and they all hated me. Everyone got so annoyed with me because I kept falling off in front of them, and then either they'd fall off and slow down, and I was generally messing up the whole race. And in the end of the day, I managed to come fifth. And I thought, well, actually, I really enjoyed this, and I'm going to start doing this as a proper sport. So that's when I went from the bike with no suspension to getting the sort of, a decent bike which had front suspension. I think it was a Scott. It had front suspension, and I started to do really well in the expert class. And then I was sponsored by a local bike shop, and it went on from there. So mountain biking was my big sport, and I won lots of races, sort of local races, and then I won the national championships and things like that. And it all I got more and more enthusiastic about biking.
We can't glaze over the fact that you're winning national championships. That's seriously impressive. And I want to ask you two questions in particular. What strengths from running helped you most with cycling and particularly mountain biking? Did you find that you were particularly able in any specific ways because of your background in running?
Yeah. I think really my general aerobic and fitness, my ability to run, my ability to ride pretty hard. I was able to ride fairly high towards my maximum heart rate, and to be able to maintain that for a long time. And also I'm quite small, I'm 5'2" and weigh 49 pounds. I think, is it pounds or kilos? And must be kilos, mustn't it? And I was really a hill runner, so I was always really good at climbing hills when I ran. And that was my forte. But the same thing started to develop. Although I told you about struggling on the hills on a road bike, as soon as I got a mountain bike, I suddenly realised actually I'm quite strong. I can ride pretty quickly uphill. And the long hills that go on for miles and miles seem to suit me the best. Not so much the very short, sharp little hills that need a ton of power. So that was my strength. And if anything, my weakness was a little bit on the technical side. So I was, I tend to come off a bit and tend to fall off.
That was my next question, actually, is how did you, what helped you go from being the person that was holding the field up on the descents to winning national championships? That's quite a progress. What was the most impactful thing to make you a better technical rider?
I think just doing it over and over again and watching some of the good athletes, talking to people. I had there was a coach in our club there was a couple of us girls, and he'd take us out to a hill and find all sorts of gnarly things for us to ride down. And that got me a lot more confident and got me a lot more. I mean, you talk about the bike body separation, which as a time trialist, there's none of that. And of course, big time bike body separation when you fall off, but obviously there's some nice bit in the middle. So yes, I learned that, and I got so much more confident about riding fast downhill, about also riding slowly downhill, where you're not just using speed to get yourself through the thing. You need to know you can ride down it in control. So I learned a lot about that. And more recently, I had some coaching in France with a company called AQR who do a lot of training and coaching for athletes and also mountain bike holidays. And that was much more extreme than our hills over here. It was in the Pyrenees. So there was some pretty rocky, for me, terrifying descents. But I sort of managed it, and I learned quite a lot out there. So I sort of learned about rocks and how to ride rocks, both up and down. And we also had a camp in Portugal I used to go to, and there are plenty of rocks and things out there and funny little technical courses we did. So yeah, I've improved hugely, and I built myself a manual machine because I'm going to learn to do a manual, and I've always wanted to do that, and I've always wanted to do a wheelie and never quite made it.
That's really cool. That's actually something that Coach Chad recently built. And if you're listening to this podcast and you don't know who he is, he's
I listen to it all the time. And I remember saying about that. And he went on the same, I think it's Kyle and April's YouTube. That's how I learned how to build mine.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's a great skill to have for sure. It's something that I need to do a whole lot better at. I want to, so you've been competing for years, and you also mentioned something else. You've overcome a ton of different obstacles throughout the course of those years. And like we're talking about here, becoming a proficient mountain biker, and you just laid out a lot of different things that you did to overcome that. So you seem to be the sort of athlete that encounters an obstacle and then kind of enjoys the process of overcoming that and learning and getting better through it.
That's the fun of it.
Yeah. And one of them that you mentioned, I think, is one that we probably don't focus on enough, which you mentioned that at some point throughout your athletic career that you had struggled with and overcame an eating disorder. And I want to know, when did you start to recognize that, and how did you start to recognize it?
Well, I was pretty unhappy at school, and the transition from junior school to senior school, I was sent away to boarding school, and it was so different. I found that quite difficult. And the whole thing of being a teenager, I found very difficult. And I realized that my body image wasn't what I wanted. And I started to think I've got to lose weight to look better, and so on, as you do. And it just all started from there. And then my parents went through a really nasty, messy divorce. And we moved to Bristol, and I was sent to a school, a girls' grammar school, and I was at a co-ed school before, and I really didn't like this school. I didn't really identify with a lot of the other kids, and some of the work I was useless at maths. I just felt generally I was a failure, and that seemed to accentuate everything. And I also felt I had no control over my life because I had no choice in being sent to this school, and I just couldn't. There's nothing I could do. I just had to live with it. And the eating disorder got worse and worse, and I just got where I completely stopped eating, apart from, I'd sort of have an apple for breakfast and drink plenty of water, and I would drink coffee because that sort of reduced my appetite. And my parents divorced, everything got worse and worse, and they were so wrapped up in themselves, they didn't really notice that I was struggling with something. So it's pretty bad because I became so unsocial. I couldn't, because when you have an eating disorder, you can't join in with anything because there's always food around, and you feel very uncomfortable around food, and you worry people will pressurize you to eat. So it's pretty bad, and it went on for really till I was about sort of 18 or 19, and I went to university, and I was really trying to get over it because I'd started running, and it was my grandmother who really helped me, because I left my parents' home and I'd spend lots of time staying with her, and she sort of slowly, she didn't make me eat, but she just had stuff and I could just have a little bit if I wanted. And I spent a lot of time walking and running. And I think it was a very slow process, but I think mentally I began to change, that I realised that I really loved running, but I was so weak that I'd go for a run and then hardly be able to walk when I got home because I had no nutrition. And I suddenly, something goes in your brain and you suddenly change. You realise, actually, maybe I will want to eat a little bit. Maybe I can eat a little bit. But it's totally mental. There's no way you can physically make someone with anorexia eat. It's probably the worst thing you can do. And they have to make the decision, actually, I'm just going to try a little bit and just going to have something. And it gradually just, but as soon as anyone pushed me, if anyone made me eat, I'd literally run from the house and I'd be gone for the whole day, or I'd stay out all night. It was so terrifying. I'd just go. And in fact, I still don't I hate Christmas because I hate being faced with lots of food. And I still carry some of the feelings of anorexia within me, and I still feel uncomfortable in social occasions, and I feel uncomfortable around lots of food or thinking I've got to eat something because people will think I'm rude if I don't. And yeah, it's a difficult one, but I do feel that I've pretty much conquered it. And it's doable. It's perfectly doable. And, I've proved it. And I eat pretty well now. I think a healthy diet, and I love my food. And, I've made progress.
When you mentioned an interesting takeaway there about an athlete that, let's just say a person that is struggling with it, that really has to be an individual choice on their end.
Oh, yeah.
That other people can't force them. So, let's externalizing this a bit more. Is there anything that either your grandma did or looking back that you wish people could have done to help you in that situation?
I think it was just being away from my parents and the stresses of that and the expectations. My father was an academic, so had very high expectations of me, and I was useless. So I think it's getting to a place where you feel comfortable in yourself and you feel other people are not trying to run your life and force you into things. Because I think that's it's a feeling of lack of power, and you have to take control, and you've got no power over what's happening to you, and you're being steered in a direction you don't want to go. You're uncertain about the future. Maybe your self-esteem is low. Maybe you're a bit of a perfectionist, so you view yourself as being not as good as you want to be. And I think that other people can help by not bullying and pushing and, oh, you've got to eat this, and because that doesn't work. When anorexia, you just can't. That will make them run away and go more in, because you go right into yourself and you retreat into a sort of self-contained little bubble, which was a comfort bubble for me. I quite like that. But it's not particularly healthy. It's, at the end of the day, I'm much better now that I can socialise, and I have good relationships with people now. But yes, so it's a lot of things, and it's such a complicated, complex illness, and it affects everyone in different ways, and there are lots of different things that spark it off, and it can be all sorts of things. But I think at the end of the day, you have to make the decision you have to decide to try and move on from it. But what was important for me was having something I could do that really made me feel good. So, for instance, running was something, it just gave me this amazing endorphin. And there was nothing else much in life that at the time that did. And suddenly I realized I'm good at this. I'm actually a really good runner. And I soon realized that I was better than most people. And I had this amazing ability and, being outdoors. And I just thought, now I've got something. It just made me feel so much better. And the eating was difficult because, unfortunately, it affects your whole gut system, your stomach. And I couldn't eat things with fat in them. I used to feel nauseous, and I felt as if it was in my stomach for hours, and I didn't like that. So it took me ages to be able to eat fats, and I'd eat sort of very low fat everything. And the recovery took ages because of the damage it does to your insides, and so on. But, everyone can get over it, and it takes a lot of doing, but, at the end of the day, you can see it through. And I think there's a lot more help for people with anorexia now. And I'm always willing to speak to anyone because I've been through it. I know exactly what it's like. But one of the things about anorexia is that, as I found, there are certain things that you might do that, are pretty unpleasant maybe. And, you really don't want to talk to a normal person about it. Whereas you could probably talk to someone else who's had the disease or going through the same thing. And people who've got anorexia, well, they'll know what I'm talking about. But yeah.
So finding a support system that has a level of relatability and experience within that can be really helpful. We're going to look through, I believe that there are some sites, and I hesitate to mention the names because I think I'll not get them correctly, but I will put them in the description below on different resources that we could have here. Also, if you are an athlete that's experienced anything like this, there'll be a forum post on this, and you can jump in there and DM me to keep it private, or DM in this case Lydia or anybody else, and if we're able to connect you with anybody, or if you've overcome something like this, please send me a message, so then I can kind of build up a bank of people that maybe might be able to serve as that support system for somebody else if they need it, if we can come across that. Because it's a tricky thing when you're talking about cycling, and that your performance in so many cases, it really does come down to your power to weight ratio. There's more that governs your performance in terms of, and your ability to fulfill your potential, absolutely. And racing is much more dynamic than just a simple numbers game. However, we do have to kind of face the facts that, yes, power to weight is important. So that can really put a lot of stress on you. But as you've mentioned, you've been able to manage it throughout these years, and you say that you still carry parts of it. So are there any sort of tactics, or what do you do now if you ever suffer any sort of temptation to entertain that condition once again? What do you do now to avoid that? Is it just focusing on performance with the sport, or your passion for the sport, or what do you do?
When I feel threatened by it, I am quite good at avoiding social occasions. And as I said before, I find Christmas very difficult. So I've got to the stage, I have horses, and I've got a very good excuse, which is, well, I can't stay because I've got to go and feed the horses, or actually I can't come because one of our horses needs some treatment. So if you don't mind, I won't join you. This year it's going to be, well, with COVID around, actually, I'm quite happy. I'm going to do disaster on TrainerRoad instead. So I won't be indulging in Christmas at all. So I usually try and not to be involved. And if it is a social occasion, most of the time, since I've given up alcohol, I'm a lot better about controlling my eating. So I won't eat till I feel uncomfortable and then feel really guilty about it, or be bulimic or something like that, I will be very sensible and just think, well, just have this, this, and this, and then walk away from it and not be tempted to sort of eat so much like everyone else does and then feel pretty awful. So I kind of manage it, but I do struggle sometimes. And, you know, I mean, I have to be honest. I could say, oh, I'm fine, I just have no problems at all, but it's not the case really. And I just find I'm much better if I've got a sort of reasonable routine that, like, I have at home, where I know what I'm going to eat, and then I train and I know what I can eat when I've trained and what I can eat before I train. And the training's a big part of keeping me sane and just keeping me happy and not feel restricted as if I'm just sitting around doing nothing and then feeling really awful. So it's a big part of my life.
Yeah, training can be a great input for that, in the sense that it can be something that's very passion driven, where we are achieving very real things for ourselves, so we can put focus into that. And then, as we've mentioned so many times before with nutrition, there does seem to be an obsession within society to starve ourselves for any number of different reasons. It exists. It's to indulge over the top and then to starve ourselves, and kind of go back and forth. And with athletics, we tend to like celebrate when people do something with, and he hardly ate anything, or she did that whole workout. And
Yes.
it's not a healthy thing at all. And in fact,
no,
we should really be pushing ourselves for like, you really fueled that effort really well. Like, cause that's something that's honestly really hard. It's something that you have to train to be good at. And I think that it's something that is, I, at least for me personally, with my relationship with food, I have found that in prioritizing training appropriately in my life, I tend to fuel my body better, and I start to provide my body what it needs. Whereas when I don't have training, it's always difficult for me, because then I start to look at things, do I really need food? Do I not? So I don't know that I've ever personally struggled with anything that you would classify as any sort of an eating disorder. But I do think it's important that all of us athletes be honest with ourselves, like what you were mentioning there, that our relationship with food is complex. It isn't something that we should just try to brush under a rug or ignore. Instead, we should try to understand that relationship and try and be patient with ourselves and loving with ourselves, and kind of walk through that and learn constantly. So hopefully, if you're listening to this, and hopefully that can be of some help to you or those that you know and love. And if you have any questions on that, please head over to the forum post for this one. This is episode 25 of the Successful Athletes podcast. So you can just search that in the TrainerRoad forum. Let's actually kind of pivot onto the training side of things. So it's really just this year, in March of 2020, this year, that you started with TrainerRoad. And I'm so curious, as soon as I read this, what was it like going to the training that you have with TrainerRoad that's very structured and very laid out to be, a very specific goal is being accomplished with it? I don't know if you trained with that level of specificity before, if that was new, but what was it like to start training with TrainerRoad this year?
It was quite exciting, really, because I had done, in the past, I'd had a coach a couple of times, and I had one, and I'd have a written training schedule. So I'd have what I was meant to do each day and at what intensity. And I was familiar with interval training, because I love interval training, and I get very bored just going for a ride. So I have to have something to spice it up. But it was still very, very different, because although I had a power tap at one stage, that was on the mountain bike. So when I trained on the road bike, which I did all my intervals on, I always just went with heart rate. And I used to sort of sit doing what I thought was sweet spot. And then I'd go off and I'd do about 6 by 1 minute and think, oh, I worked so hard. And then I'd go home. And then when I got to TrainerRoad, I had the biggest shock of my life when I saw some of your sessions, because I thought, well, there seemed to be 3 sets of about 8 of these things, like the one I did last night, which was Ainsley Adams, and so hard. And but I thought, well, if this is really going to work, I've got to stick with it. So I started in sweet spot base, and I again, it was quite hard because it was far longer than I thought. After about half an hour, I thought, well, I've done enough now. I think I'll just make a coffee and go. I think I'll just finish. I've never trained like this before. But I stuck it out, and the more I stuck it out, the more I enjoyed it. And then I found that I could quite successfully do it, and there was no question of stopping workouts halfway through. That's not really me. So I thought, no, you do your workouts, you sit there and you get through it, and you put something on in the background to listen to, which is podcast normally. And I really got addicted. So now I'm a bit addicted to it. And I found that, as most people do, that I did the FTP test, and I think it came out at about 130, which is very low. And I thought, oh, so lousy. I'm almost ashamed to tell anybody what my FTP is. So I worked my way up from that. And then the next time I tested, which was probably about, in the summer, and it was probably sort of June or something, and it was 155. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a jump. Because I thought, well, I'm too old to really be improving much. And it was such a shock. I just thought, well, is there something wrong with my computer, or is there something wrong with my trainer? I thought, well, it must be a mistake. So then I started training with it. And sure enough, particularly the sweet spot and below sweet spot, I was absolutely fine, brilliant, just swinging along thinking, yeah, this is fine. And then as soon as I started doing the build phase, things changed a bit. And the first VO2 max I did, I was nearly crying. It was just awful. It was just, everything hurt. Thought I was going to asphyxiate myself. I just had a terrible time. And I thought, no way am I going to put the intensity down. And I went to bed. I was just in the right state thinking, I don't understand. I can't do this. I don't know what's wrong with me. And I went into a sort of bit of a depression about it, and got on the forum, and then found that a lot of other people were going through the same thing and struggling. And it's just the way it sort of starts. So now I'm finding I can do the VO2 max pretty well now, and it's all becoming easier in a way. So it shouldn't become easier, but it's gone from being an absolute killer to something that's bearable and something I quite
more manageable.
More manageable.
Yeah,
not being that's the wreck.
Yes, that's the tough part. Is I think that a lot of the time with training progression in general, we forget that there is a progression to training a lot of the time. And a progression doesn't mean that it's always perfectly gradual. Sometimes it's a bit steeper than others. Mm-hmm. And then, but over time, it tends to become more manageable. And you have to progress those energy systems kind of, intelligently or strategically, I should say, and how you go about it. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in trying to find those, appropriate ramp rates for all those different energy systems that you're trying to train up. So, a 128 to 155 FTP increase in 4 months. But then not only that, you've done a ton of races this year. And I want to get into, a couple things, and I'll say these things so then you don't have to blush. But I'll say them just the same. So you won an 8-hour endurance mountain bike race. You got third in the over 50 division at a 2-hour cyclocross race, which 2-hour cyclocross race sounds like a nightmare for most people of doing, those intense efforts. And then second at the Wessex cyclocross over 50 as well. You've won plenty of different events in different spots. And also, to be clear, you're competing in the over 50 category many times, even though you could be competing in the over 60 category if it was allocated as such.
Yes, and often it isn't.
Right. So that's just hugely impressive. And I think that's really inspiring. And what you said, with talking about how you felt like you were too old to see those sort of improvements, and replace, if you're listening to this right now, whoever you are, replace too old with whatever your reason is. And I think that a lot of us have reasons that we put in, myself included. Many times it's I'm too busy, or I have too much going on, or I'm too stressed, or something else. And we'll put those things in place. And as a result, they really do serve as blocks. But if we just take the steps forward, we can really topple a lot of personal barriers. And man, it's so empowering. So I just find it really inspiring what you've been able to do with that, Lydia. I want to end things with two questions. First of all, you also did a 200-mile South Downs Way unsupported ride. It took you 27 hours. It was brutal. And I can imagine your definition of bad weather in the UK is very different than my definition of bad weather here. So can you walk us through really quick what that race was like? And I guess what got you through in the tough points? Because I imagine over those 27 hours, there were really hard points where you wanted to quit. So what made you keep going?
I'd built up to this through meeting people who were into this ultra endurance, and I discovered there was you go for a record on an unsupported attempt at this 200 mile. It's out and back. It's basically 100 miles from where I live out to Eastbourne, which is a coastal town 100 miles away, on an ancient old drover's road that has a lot of history attached to it. And it's virtually no road, and it's just continual hills. It's not like your area, your sort of climbs, but just up and down all the time. And the terrain is chalk, a lot of it, which is extreme in the wet. It's just extremely slippery and pretty dangerous to ride on. This event, it's something you can choose to do anytime, but you do need proof that you've done it. So there were spies out who'd suddenly pop out behind a bush, just checking that there I was, and I didn't have someone opening gates for me, and I was on my own, and I was going along. I hadn't got secret backup anywhere, and these little people would suddenly jump out, and sometimes they'd accompany me for a bit on their bike, and weren't allowed to open gates or anything, because that's part of it. And the other thing is, you're not allowed to give you food or any sort of medical attention, they can say, "How are you doing, mate?" or something, and I'd go, "Oh, I'm terrible." Or if I was in a good mood, I'd say, "Oh, brilliant, I'm absolutely flying," and whatever. And it was so hard. And I decided to start at 9:00 in the evening, which was probably a bit of a mistake, because I set off in the dark, and as soon as it started to rain, I went off straight into a ditch full of nettles and got my face stung with nettles, which was fairly unpleasant. And this was after about 35 miles. So, and then the weather sort of went from bad to worse. And by the time I got to the 100-mile marker, I was on schedule, because I decided I wanted to get there in 12 hours. So it sounds very slow, but it's a very hard ride, and particularly in the wet. And I got there, and I had Rory Hitchens, who was doing the photography and generally organising me. And he was at the turn point to check, obviously to say hi and take a photo and check that I'd got down to the turn point, so I hadn't gone and taken a shortcut or something. And by which time it was raining really hard. And I got to the point where I tried to get on the bike, and I ended up walking up the first point after the turn. And then it got better and better for a bit. And then I should think 3/4 of the way through, it suddenly just all went downhill. I started to feel nauseous. I'd been eating gels all the time, and I suddenly felt terribly nauseous. I couldn't get any drink down me apart from plain water. I didn't want to eat anything, and everything just went from bad to worse, and my shoulders were hurting and one of my knees was hurting. And by the time I got to sort of 30 miles from home, I was feeling pretty desperate. But then I thought, well, I'm only 30 miles from home. It's nothing, anyone can do 30 miles. And even if I walk some of it, one step forward is better than just sitting moaning and wishing an alien would come down and take you away. So it was really tough. And then I started to get hallucinations and see sort of bears in the trees. And I had these funny little black things that would race towards me, and which I think were to do with the lights the reflections of the lights, but everything seemed to be hallucinating. And then I saw a couple of wombats back in front of me, and I braked because I didn't want to hit them, and all these weird, wonderful things. And it was, I thought, well, somehow I'm going to get back. And I eventually got back and I was just sort of exhilarated, because the last sort of on this ride, the last sort of 3 or 4 miles, a lot of it's downhill, and I was absolutely flying. And I suddenly got a new lease of life, and sort of felt great. And I had the last of I think I had cherry bakewells or something. I had the last of those, and then I sort of went flying into the finish, and with the celebrations at the end. And it was midnight by then on a Friday night in Winchester, and lots of drunks wandering around and police cars, and I was fine. And then as soon as I got off my bike, I felt extremely weird. I felt I was going to pass out, and I ended up lying on my back on this little wall, and with the police cars driving around looking at me as if I was drunk. And it was a wonderful experience. And I wrote a piece about it afterwards, and had lots of photos, which unfortunately I lost, but computer ate them, so that was sad. But no, it was an amazing experience. But do I want to do it again? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. So I haven't. It's not something I want to do, because I don't think I've got a artificial hip and partial knee, and I just thought it's just too much to put my body through to attempt that again. So although I do long distance ride, I can ride 10 or 12 hours non-stop, but 27 hours is it's pushing it a bit.
Yeah.
And I didn't stop at all. I was riding all the time, and mostly I ate. I had things I ate while I was riding, and then if I stopped to open a gate, if I wanted to get one of my cherry bakewells out, or a little ham sandwich I had, I'd stop and eat it while I was opening the gate. Tried to be quite efficient with the timings and everything. And there were water stops on the way, so I sort of arranged. I had filled my bottles up with water and all that sort of thing. But the planning of the whole thing was it took me quite a long time to plan it. And then I weighed everything that I was going to take with me, and I had to make sure I took minimal weight, because the weight's a huge factor. And to take any unnecessary food or equipment, or you don't take your toothbrush and your deodorant, and people talk about baby wipes, and I thought, no, I don't like those. I won't even take those. And I sort of, anything unnecessary I didn't take. So I got it all organized, and many late nights planning the whole thing. And so yeah, it was an incredible event and very memorable. I'd want other people to do it. I think everyone should have a go at it.
There are some things that I feel like are best one and done, so to speak. Like,
yeah,
and I feel like I've done over 200 miles once, and I was like, that's good. I've checked that box. You
have.
Yeah. Last question that I wanted to ask you here, Lydia, is with an athlete with so much experience, training and just being an endurance athlete for so many years, what do you see in us younger athletes? And do you kind of wish that you could just give us a piece of advice? Like, what are we missing out on? What piece of wisdom are we missing out on that you have earned over the years?
I think some of the things are the mistakes I've made and learnt by, and the things most of the time my life is all about learning by mistakes, unfortunately. Well, I think it's a good way to learn, but yeah, you learn by mistakes. And one of the things that I'd always like to say to a young athlete, don't get faddy about food. Don't worry too much about your diet and then you've got to train so hard all the time. You're not mixing with your friends. You're not playing on the computer game. You're not going out and I think it's so important, and I didn't do this, but it's so important for a young person to have a life and not feel guilty about not training, and to enjoy their training, because there's so much time in life. I mean, I've had so many years of being a competitive athlete, and I think, as a teenager, they're growing, they need to eat well, they need to get plenty of sleep, and just not be stressed about, not to worry about if you don't do so well in a race, and not to worry too much about, having a fatty diet and doing all these things, because as long as you eat healthily, don't just eat pizza every day, all day, every day and stuff. It can really mess you up if you start to get anxious about that. And I think there's enough for young people these days to be anxious about, what with the schooling and all the exams and all the problems with, funding their uni. And there's so many things to worry about. They don't want to be worried. Their training and racing wants to be fun, and it wants to be a social thing as well. And, and then as you get older, yes, you can think, oh, well, I'm going to train really hard, I'm going to do high volume, TrainerRoad, and you're not at that stage. I don't think it's so important. But I also think the other mistake I made was I overtrained myself so much that I'd run through injuries. I had a bad knee problem with an accident at work, and I never got it seen to, and it ended up with me having a new hip and a partial new knee because of that knee injury. And I took no notice. I just thought, no, I'm not stopping running. Yes, it's a bit sore, but I'm going to run through it. But to always, if there's anything wrong, don't just think you can run through it and that you're going to be better, because you're not. And it's far better to let the body recover and see somebody, go and see a doctor, or go and see a really good sports physio and really get to the bottom of it, because otherwise it'll keep coming back to you, and then you get more and more depressed and more feeling you're losing all your fitness. And mainly, if you feel you're not enjoying it anymore, then look for another thing to do, look for another sport. And you never know, you might get back to it. Like a lot of people go out of it when they get married, maybe, and have children, and then later in their 40s and 50s, they're all going back into the competing in the masters and categories.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could inspire younger athletes. I mean, I'm not sure if I do, and I also wish I could inspire more women to come into the sport, and so on.
Well, I think that's what you're accomplishing right now. You can count me as an inspired person for sure. So I love doing this podcast. Lydia, thank you so much for doing this. Like I mentioned, we're going to have a forum thread on this, and Lydia is on the forum as well. So if you have questions for Lydia, you just enjoyed this podcast, let Lydia know. That would be awesome. You can go over, once again, just search for episode 25. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, much like Lydia, then go to trainerroad.com. That's how you do it there. It will get you faster. Build your plan with Plan Builder even before you sign up. Check it out. See if it's what you want to do, and then give it a shot. And we'll see you, I guess, probably listening to the podcast, maybe at some races in the future. It'd be exciting. So, Lydia, thanks again for doing this. This is fantastic, and we'll talk to you soon.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. Cheers.